Welcome to Golden Record, an S&P Market Intelligence podcast, where we explore challenges, solutions, and hot topics in the world of corporate actions. I'm your host, Amanda Burgess, from the Managed Corporate Action business within S&P Market Intelligence. My aim with this podcast is to consolidate our corporate actions experience as a data supplier with outside industry experts to provide listeners with a fresh, holistic perspective on corporate actions that you can relate to. We understand complex corporate actions and their impact on the industry, so we also plan to bring some of those tricky corporate actions here where we can dig into the details with our listeners. We have some great topics slated for our first few episodes, but in line with how we run our business, I want to talk about what you want to talk about. So if you have a topic that you think would benefit the community, we'd love to hear from you. You can shoot us an email at the address included in the podcast description. In our pilot episode titled, Is Data the Problem?, we'll focus on the massive costs and risks associated with lack of complete corporate actions data, the increased need for corporate actions automation, and why these two topics are part of the same conversation. My guest for today is Barney Nelson of the Value Exchange. In one of Barney's recent campaign initiatives titled Corporate Actions 2021, he partnered with several great organizations to gather data through a customer survey, and through that was able to publish a study containing some data that might surprise you. We touch on some of these highlights during our chat. All right, let's jump in. Thanks, Barney, for delving into some of these insights with me today.
Thanks very much, Amanda, for having me.
So to just kind of start, can you tell me a little bit more about the survey and the stakeholders involved to gather those insights, and also what drove the study?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think if you go back to any point in the last 20 years, you know, that one of the great frustrations about the corporate actions industry is that we feel like we've been up against the same problems for a very long time, and that we've all kind of struggled to get our arms around it really in terms of making meaningful change. So a couple of years ago, we stepped in you know, from the Value Exchange perspective, our job is to help make the right business case for change and for tech transformation amongst kind of practitioners across the corporate action lifecycle. And so a couple of years ago, we started digging into the corporate actions problem. Really, first of all, looking at the overall end-to-end processing of the corporate action kind of life cycle from pretty much from the kind of CSD level through the intermediaries, custodians, brokers, and so on out to the investors. You know, we dug into a lot of where the challenges and pressures were there. But as we'll come on to, you know, I think one of the big problems that was flushed out was ultimately the huge role that data plays in the overall inefficiencies of the corporate action processing overall. And so we followed that up in 2021, as you say, with the corporate actions data project, specifically looking at the role of corporate actions data as part of the overall problem. And we've since added to that with specific studies in markets like Australia and more to come, ultimately really keeping on going back and just trying to dig into, you know, basically, as I said, the meaningful case for change, and try to basically help people across the industry to frame the problem better and to therefore find the right solutions.
Yeah, so that kind of leads me to another question. In the study, one of the statistics you shared was that 70% of business units across the world are paying out over $2 million USD in corporate action errors, and that data is the root cause of majority, 56% of these errors. So would we talk about the different intermediaries that, you know, were part of the survey? I mean, who is absorbing those costs? Is it custodian banks? Is it brokers? Is it, you know, the investor?
Yeah, so I think there's, you know, that cost specifically. I mean, ultimately, the who's bearing it? It's, you know, generally speaking, it's the custodians and the brokers who are basically, where there's an error in the intermediary change, they're making it good to the end investor. That's most acute in Asia Pacific. The number was far higher in APAC. I think 70% of investors or something like that. So 78, I think, and lowest, I believe, in Europe. But I think really, it's quite important to realize that's only part of the picture. So it gets much worse very quickly, because on top of the 2 million, you've also got the industry was basically citing the fact that the physical cost of the errors was not necessarily the biggest problem. The biggest challenge was the huge amount of time, distraction, and an effort that had to go into the remediation process, alongside the kind of the write-offs and the provisions. And then on top of that, you've got what's been referred to as the $9 million problem, which is the opportunity cost that we miss out on from voluntary events. So basically incorrect elections, missed elections. And those costs are really, because they're implicit, not explicit, those are the ones that you and I, as pension holders, are really bearing, because of the fact that basically the whole chain is missing them. So ultimately, the $2 million number is a fraction of the overall cost.
Not to mention, when you talk about these firms having to devote unpredicted time and energy towards, resolving these, then you're also increasing risk, because they're stretched now to cover all of these, correction errors, while they're still having to keep up with corporate actions. That's not going to stop.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a real vicious circle going on in a lot of cases, that these errors come because of highly manual processes and very stretched staff. And then, as you say, when you take a team that's already running at 100+% of capacity, and then suddenly throw at them a whole remediation exercise that goes up to the CEO, usually of the firm, for a week or so. That's all capacity that basically it's not provided for. And exactly as you say, it detracts from BAU, has to be provided for somewhere. And, that means more tired hands, more space for risk, more space for mistakes. Absolutely.
Right. And then kind of back to the point about, bad data or incomplete data being, a root part of the problem. Are we talking, timing, accuracy?
It's an interesting one. I think, traditionally people tend to look at data, obviously, exactly as you said, as completeness, timeliness, accuracy. But I think when we did the research, the other dimension that we layered on top of that was just the need to manually intervene. So the need to touch the data, either on a BAU or an exceptional level. And that actually really stood out as being basically the single problem that the industry has with their corporate action data today. So very little of it essentially goes straight through from end to end. A lot of it is is depending on where you are in the event spectrum. A dividend probably does pass straight through reasonably easily. The complex end, rights issues, spin-offs, things like that, you go straight to the PDF, and those are the areas where, you have all of the problems. You have obviously the fact that you've got to go and get the data means it's incomplete. The fact that you've had to go and look at it means that it's, there's a data latency issue. And by the time you've rekeyed it in, you've probably got a data quality issue as well. So I think all of the issues kind of all manifest themselves in kind of roughly the same level, but it all comes back to the single point, which is that there's an enormous amount of data interpretation and data validation going on in the industry, regardless almost of the market you're in.
So, if this issue with data is so widespread, why do you think the industry isn't being more proactive about a solution?
Yeah, I think there's probably a couple of issues. I think one is there's the buy-in for change, and then there's two is what change to make. And I think buy-in for change. A lot of organizations that we spoke to, you could see very clearly that ultimately the corporate action problem doesn't really leave the back office very well. So it doesn't have a huge share of mind at the COO even, or the CEO level of an organization. So basically the CFO, compliance, and ops are the only people who really carry the cost of the corporate action problem today. And it's incredible how the awareness of the corporate action problem dissipates as you move towards the front office and towards kind of business management. So ultimately, why are people not reacting more? I think generally speaking, there's a lack of awareness. And the only reason that, the only catalyst for that change is basically when something goes hideously wrong. And you've seen that in certain very high profile cases, but generally everyone we spoke to, the reason why they'd actually made an investment in the last few years was because they'd had an enormous catastrophic failure of many millions of dollars that basically the CEO turned around and said, never again.
So I want to pause here for a second to add a layer. Just a couple of days after I had this conversation with Barney, I was speaking with one of our customers, a large investment bank. Probably because it was fresh on my mind, the conversation evolved into this discussion about errors. And he broke down for me exactly what happens at his firm when there's a corporate actions error that results in a loss. Regardless of whether the error is an internal error or influenced by some exterior factors, bad data, or whatever it may be, his manager and his manager and her manager and their manager all have someone looking for answers and looking for solid preventative solutions so it doesn't happen again. He talked about daily reports, additional QC measures, ongoing additional checks because their client now has a trust issue and it can't happen again. We've heard so many stories from customers and potential customers over the years, these tragic tales triggered by some massive financial loss. Actually, losses due to bad or incomplete data are often why firms come to us in the first place. Some of you might be nodding your head, remembering the time. It's real and it's scary. Okay, back to Barney. So a moment ago, you were talking about the need for increased automation in order to reduce risk and how mail messaging is really dominant in this space, largely because they're not getting, the clean, robust, comprehensive data from the onset. They're having to spend time scouring the prospectuses and read key data. So not only when communicating it to their investors, but also when collecting it and preparing that record. Now, in your study, you talk about communication mediums, including web portals, fax, email, ISO standard messaging. Do you think that this manual messaging is due to system constraints primarily, or does it again go back to that data being incomplete? Or is it that you're getting it from a multitude of sources? Or is it a combination of all this? I don't know if one is a greater cause than the other.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's all of the above, really. I mean, I think, for me, the fact that I think 46% of communications into custodians is either by website or portals, and then more than 50% of communications to investors is equally manual, throws up a couple of points. I think first of all, it shows that that the information is not available automatically from source. So there's problem number one, that ultimately from the issuer or the issuer agent, we're not able to extract out a machine readable, systematically structured message that basically people can trust at an intermediary level and an investor level. But I think also that the fact that those two numbers, the intermediary number and the investor number, are different also highlights some kind of bad behaviors, I think, in terms of actually, for example, really how investors, wealth managers, and their clients still insist on receiving their information. So, problem number one is the ability to source this information right and systematically in a structured way. Problem number two is that a lot of people aren't actually demanding or aren't, basically they're not pushing to have this information given to them in a systematic way. From when I was in, custodian banks, we would have to write fax disclaimers all the time for people to receive a fax of their corporate actions because they insisted on that instead of an MT message. So you've got a couple of problems there, I think. And I think what's great is that we're starting to see from, markets like Australia, markets like Switzerland and so on and so forth, some really great progress on both of those points by providing something that is golden copy across the market, therefore trusted, reliable, dependable, but that's also structured in a way that scales with the complexity of the messages so that basically when people get it, they know that it's complete and there's no recourse to the PDF.
Now, you mentioned Australia and Switzerland. Are these issuers?
It's in both cases, it's really the CSD or the exchange who has actually stood in the middle and actually really picked up the kind of picked up the challenge and actually worked with issuers and their agents to be able to pull in a kind of logicized event information straight from source, so that effectively when the CSD or the exchange then disseminates it, it's basically golden from the word go. And of course, that removes this fundamental problem, which is the lack of trust in what you're getting at the moment. And as a result, therefore, negates the need to be double checking it, triple checking it, and so on and so forth. So, I think that is great evidence of progress being made. Equally, obviously, there's an enormous amount of data scrubbing and cleaning that goes on across the industry with a similar intent in mind. But yeah, both of those are essentially golden copy ISO 2022 or 1522, I think, in Switzerland, messages that go straight out without the need for checking.
That's interesting. I wonder how much time that adds to the initial issuer announcement. Just knowing how urgent corporate actions are, that'd be an interesting information to have.
It's a great point, because ultimately the timeliness of the event notification is critical for the success of the whole thing. And I think you've seen some markets have really stumbled on that in terms of trying to bring out a similar thing. And the speed has been the critical kind of casualty, if you like. So I think, ultimately, if it's going to be good and usable, it has to be quick, exactly to your point. And I think those markets are succeeding, others are struggling. But ultimately, I think it for me, speed is more of a technology question and a process question. I think, in the world of, there's no silver bullet in the whole corporate action space, but ultimately, to get the information logicized and trusted as step one, to then accelerate it as step two, it's a much smaller step, and ultimately, it's all a journey towards a very, very good destination.
I'm interested to follow their progress, but looking at our or my perspective with corporate actions in North America, we're likely to continue to see these layers of event validation throughout the life cycle. So where does the industry go from here? I mean, we need better data. We need more synchronous communication of the data.
Honestly, I think for me, the main thing I'd underline is that, that there is, as I said at the beginning, we've spent the last, 20, 30 years complaining about this space. I think there is more cause for optimism now in terms of the technologies, the solutions available than we've had ever, I think. And so, I'm in a world that has a reputation for not having moved on very much, I'm really quite excited about what we're seeing at the moment and what we're going to see in the next couple of years. So, STP rates in corporate actions are ticking upwards. As a result, as pension holders, we're getting basically all of that missed opportunity cost that I was talking about at the beginning. So long as those numbers go down, then we're all in good shape.
Well, thanks again, Barney. If you'd like to read and hear more about Barney's campaigns covering corporate actions, post-trade technology, and DLT, they're available at thevx.io. If any of this resonated with you, you might be interested in how our managed corporate actions data solution can be your data solution. If so, reach out to one of our corporate actions specialists from the link below. I'm Amanda Burgess. Thank you for joining me for the pilot episode of Golden Record. Keep listening.